This video is sponsored by DistroKid. When it comes to mixing vocals, I always have 7 essential effects ready to go in my mixing template. These tools instantly add not only a lush ambient sound to my vocals, but also depth, clarity, and dimension. Really, I'm talking about that polish that can help separate an amateur's mix from a professional's. I'm going to share these 7 effects with you throughout the rest of this video, and hopefully inspire you to incorporate some of these effects into your future mixes. But before we dive into the first effect, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, DistroKid. If you're an artist who's constantly dropping new music, DistroKid can simplify your life and save you a lot of money in the process. Millions of artists, myself included, rely on DistroKid to get their music onto all the major streaming platforms including Spotify, Apple Music, and more. With DistroKid's mobile app for iPhone and Android, managing your music and earnings is a piece of cake. No need to boot up your computer, you can upload and release your latest tracks directly from your phone. Keep an eye on your earnings with the bank feature, and when it's time to cash out, just a few taps in the app and you're good to go. Don't miss a beat with push notifications that let you know when you're earning royalties and when your funds are on the way. I love how DistroKid hooks you up with a hyperfollow landing page for every release. It's awesome for sharing your music with your fans and makes it super easy for them to save it on their preferred platform. And accessing the link through the app, super easy and convenient. Artists I've worked with swear by DistroKid, and I'm sure you'll love it too. Download the app for free on iOS and Android today, and if you're new to DistroKid, use my link down below to save 7% off your first year subscription. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video, and now, back to the content. Now, before we fully explore the 7 effects in my session, let's first talk about the setup. I want to point out that I'm applying my effects via ascend or in parallel, so I'm not applying effects directly to my vocal track via an insert, but instead I'm sending it elsewhere in my session and applying the effects that way. This gives me a lot more control over a signal and helps me save on CPU, as I don't need to run multiple instances of the same effect. Instead, I can have one instance that I feed all of my tracks into, which can help achieve a more cohesive sound amongst them. Some of these effects will also rely heavily on automation, and therefore using ascend makes automation easier. And one extra thing to consider before we get started is I'm going to exclusively be using the Wave Studio Rack and their StudioVerse system, which allows you to use their plugins and has the benefit of giving you access to a variety of plugin chains made by the community, including from yours truly. I'm going to be leaving links to my StudioVerse profile down in the description below, so if you have access to Wave Studio Rack and the plugins available, then you can absolutely use exactly what I'm showing you in this video right now with no setup needed. Just simply download it and start using it today. But I don't want you to worry if you don't use Wave's plugins or the Studio Rack. Everything that I'm going to be showing you in this video is applicable regardless of what you're using. It's going to be more about the intention and the thought process behind what I'm doing rather than the specific tool itself. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the first effect in the session, which is a reverb. And spoiler alert, I have 2 different reverbs in this session, so hang tight. I'm going to explain the difference between each of them in a moment, but this first one that I want to focus on is a plate reverb specifically. Now in this session, I'm relying on the Abbey Road Plates reverb here, and I'm further sculpting it afterwards with some additional processing that we'll talk about in a moment. And the idea here really with this first reverb is that I want a tighter plate sound that can just add some ambience, but without totally suffocating the vocal or pushing it too far into the background. But this is a pretty flexible reverb and it accomplishes exactly what I want. I'm typically after something that sounds like an EMT 140, and this reverb does a good job of emulating that. It gives you access to a variety of plates and some additional tools to sculpt your reverb sound with. But one of the most important sounds, because I'm using this on ascend, is making sure that I keep my dry wet pretty high and also playing with the pre-delay to create just a little bit of delay before the vocal actually starts getting affected. This helps the vocal stay up front and not get washed out by the reverb. Instead of the reverb being applied immediately, there's a slight delay that allows that dry vocal to cut through first and foremost. Now, as I mentioned, I'm following up this plate reverb with some EQ first and foremost, which is the Renaissance EQ here, and I'm just getting rid of some low end in particular, filtering out some lows below 131, and then also taking out a little bit of 285. I'm also getting rid of a little bit of 694, but overall I'm just cleaning out the low end to prevent that from building up in the reverb, because of course this can sound very muddy if we push too much into it. Now I'm following up the EQ with some compression, the Renaissance compressor in particular. I have some aggressive settings here, but I'm ultimately using this just to create a more consistent reverb sound here. Sometimes the reverb can be very dynamic. It can come up front, it can dip into the background. So by using the compressor, I can make this sound more consistent and present behind the vocal at the same time. And I'm closing the chain off with some Magma BB Tube saturation. And this is just enhancing the reverb a little bit more, making it more pronounced once again, adding some harmonic content to it, which is going to allow it to cut a little bit better, especially on smaller devices in particular. So let me quickly bypass all of the effects and I'll play this and then just put the reverb in and out, and you can see exactly what it's doing.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like you know, someone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They be learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach. You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They been learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach.
So ultimately just enhancing the vocal, adding a little bit of ambience to make it sound a little bit more vibey and not so dry or direct into your face. But that leads me to the second effect in my session here, which is another reverb, as I mentioned, and that's a hall reverb. Now I say hall reverb, but the reality is I just want a reverb that is actually much more elongated, that's much more present and deeper, darker, more ambient. I want something that's basically exaggerated here. So I have my first reverb being that tight plate, and the second one is going to be something that adds a lot more vibe and texture. And if I'm being honest, we're not always going to use this most likely, but on some songs it'll really make sense. So for this I have a similar chain but with a couple of differences, and the interesting thing is I start this actually with an EQ where I'm just notching out some very noticeable resonances from the vocal, including some low end cutting here, but then I actually follow this EQ, which I start the chain with the reverb itself, and I'm using Reverb here. I'm specifically using one of their hall settings, and I've just dialed in some things to achieve a proper reverb sound. Now something that's worth mentioning here is it's important to calculate your reverb times based on the tempo of your song. This song here has a tempo of 139, and I'm going to leave a link to a reverb calculator down below, but I've ultimately used this reverb calculator to determine exactly how much reverb time and pre-delay I should have to achieve a much more elongated type of effect. This is about a half note type of reverb sound that's relevant to my song here, but of course based on your tempo when using this yourself, you're probably going to want to adjust the pre-delay and the time settings. I've explained the pre-delay from before, but of course we have another one being applied to this hall reverb, and the reverb time itself is obviously much more elongated to ensure that we have this sort of consistent reverberated presence. Now following the reverb, I'm enhancing this with some more saturation via the Magma BB tube. So again, the saturation is really just enhancing it, adding harmonic content, and allowing this reverb to cut through even more. And because reverb is traditionally stereo, I'm actually pushing the stereo image of it even more with an S1 imager. So just making it a little bit more 3D, more into the sides, and basically allowing the middle to be dominated a little bit more by the dry vocal, whereas this is pushing it more into the stereo field and ultimately getting out of the way a little bit. And I'm closing the chain with another Renaissance EQ, just again sculpting some low end, making sure that it doesn't get too muddy or too pronounced, because this is something that can really happen with reverbs and wash out your vocal. I'm going to bypass the plate. Let's put the hall verb in and out and see what this sounds like instead.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They been learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach.
So you can hear how much more elongated and present it is, and I just want to make sure you guys understand the difference between the plate and the hall. So I'm going to play it one more time and just cycle both of them back and forth, and you could hear the difference between them.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They been learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach. They just study all these shows. They hear my songs when they play on the radio and when they watch TV shows. Feeling for me, you know, like they part of their nose. A guinea, I gotta go get it like everything, oh.
So hopefully you can tell the difference, particularly in that reverb time. That's really the key thing, is how long the reverb lingers and adds the ambience. Now, if you need more help with reverb in particular, click the card you see on screen or the one in the description down below to watch my 8 vocal reverb tips video. Next, I've got 3 different delays always set up in my session, and each has a slightly different pattern, although this chain is essentially the same for all 3, and I'll break that down in a moment. But something I want to point out with delays, you need room in order to use delays. You don't want to be applying delays when there's no space for it. So as an example in this session, you can see that there is definitely some breaks in the performance where Oshan, the artist, is not performing. However, he does have a couple of spots where there are little fill-ins that may make it less ideal to use the delay. However, as long as there's space, you can use them. The key is just going to be making sure you have enough space for each pattern that's relevant. If there's no space, then delays can ultimately become messy because they'll start overlapping with other parts of your vocal, and we want to avoid that. We want to make sure that the main vocal is clear and upfront, but that the delays add a cool little pattern or repeat. And for that reason, I love to use automation in particular to ensure that I'm only echoing or repeating certain parts of the vocal performance. I may not necessarily want every single line to be repeated because, again, that might create some overlap and congestion between the dry vocal and the delay effect. So with that being said, I have 3 delay effects here, at least 3 that I want to talk about right now, which is the delay short, delay medium, and delay long. Let's focus on the short first. I'm specifically relying on H delay, and again, I'm using this across the board, but the key difference here is that I'm using an 8th note pattern here. This is a very quick pattern that's going to essentially repeat things very quickly, and of course I have it synced to the tempo of the session, which is 139. If you don't have this synced to the tempo, then what's going to happen is, again, it's just going to be offbeat. It's not going to sound right. I am doing a little bit of filtering directly on here, but I do continue to do it throughout, and I have some feedback, of course. But one thing I do want to mention with these Waves plugins is I turn analog off. I don't want to add any type of noise that these plugins produce to my sound. I want to keep it mostly clean. And if you do feel the need to add some modulation, some chorus type of effects and whatnot, you can use it, but I haven't used it at all here. Now, following the H delay, I have another filter, just like on the previous ones that I showed you. And this is filtering again from about 131 and below, keeping that low end nice and clean. But again, remember, I'm doing this in addition to the previous filtering, which was focused on about 100 hertz with a low pass of almost 6K. So we got the H delay going into the EQ, and then the EQ is followed by what I think is a very slept on plugin, which is Mondo Mod. And this is really cool because it adds some movement to your sound. It basically creates more of a stereoized type of effect. It's a type of a chorus effect, I believe, or a modulation effect. And I am applying this again just to enhance and make that delay feel a little bit more interesting. So remember, this is an 8th note. If we look at the medium delay, which is the exact same chain, the only difference is now I've bumped it up to a quarter note. So it's obviously a little bit later. It's not happening so quickly or so instantly after the delay is triggered. And then finally on the long, I have a half note. So it's the exact same. Once again, all the other settings are the same, but I have a half note being applied, which is even longer. And now, to be honest, the long one doesn't get as much use as the others, but I do like having all 3 available. And depending on your tempo, if you have a much faster tempo, then maybe the half note is going to get utilized more because now a quarter note is too quick and you're not going to be able to get that exact repeat that you want, whereas a half note would be more appropriate. I want to show you what each of these sounds like. So first, let's look at the short. With the short, I'm actually applying a pretty much static move. So everything is going to be delayed. And I'm using this very gently because I want to just add that texture, but I don't want it to get too messy, although you are definitely going to hear there's a little bit of overlap. But overall, it's just allowing the vocal to not feel so dry and sterile, especially since I'm going to be playing this in solo without any of the other effects.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They be learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach.
So you can especially hear the delay in those in-betweens, obviously, whereas when I had it at the beginning and it wasn't in, it just felt very dry. Vocal stopped, that was it, nothing else happening, whereas when I put it in, you're now able to hear a little bit of that ping pong, that stuff going back and forth and hearing that delay filling in that gap. Just again, adding a little bit more interest and variety. Now with the medium delay, I've actually automated this because I think it would be much more applicable and appropriate. You can see that there's moments where I haven't, but for the most part, I wanted to delay the end phrase. Now I do this on purpose because if I delay the entire thing, it's going to start getting really messy, as I mentioned. So check this out and you can hear the difference with and without and how much more interesting it makes it.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They be learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach.
You can obviously tell this is better because if I had it applied the whole time, it would be echoing every single thing and including this, right? You wouldn't even have a proper gap there to hear this delay because then it would be, everything would be getting delayed. Automating from this POV makes a lot more sense. Now let's take a look at the long delay, which I haven't actually used, but I'll show you an example just for the sake of it. Let's focus on the end here.
Agini, I gotta go get it like everything, oh.
Now you can hear how much more elongated this is, and that's why I like having 3 different patterns in my session. I want the really quick one for some texture, the second one, the medium one for more repeats, and then the long one for specific phrases that might need a little bit of a longer repeat, especially if there's more room to fill in. But to be honest, this isn't all of the delays in my session. In fact, I have one more delay here that I didn't talk about that's a little bit different from these, and that would be a slap delay. It's basically a very tight delay, tighter than even the shortest one I showed you before, which was an 8th note pattern. And that means we're typically going to go to about a 32nd note or a 64th note. Really, we want to go somewhere between 50 to 200 milliseconds, but I do tend to prefer to be in a tempo sync type of situation when I'm using these delays, period. But I really feel like it sounds like if you see someone performing at a concert, they'll say something into the microphone, and then there might be like a split moment where you don't hear, and then all of a sudden it comes out right away, right? It's not delayed enough that there's just this big gap, but it's enough that you could hear there's some discernible difference between the original vocal and what happens next, as I'm about to show you in a moment. So for this, I'm actually using the Manny Marroquin delay here, and I have two different delay patterns on the left and right channel. The left is a 1/32nd pattern, and the right is a 64th pattern. I've also added a couple of effects here with a distortion and a doubler just to make it a little bit more interesting and pronounced. And this difference not only creates that slapback type of effect, but it also helps create more of a stereoized type of effect, which I like. Helps kind of create more thickness in the vocal, even if it's in a subtle kind of way. And just for good measure, I am following this up with yet another low cut filter, again around 131, just cleaning up that low end as we've already discussed. Let's play this without it and with it.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They be learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach. They just study all these shows. They hear my songs when they play on the radio and when they watch TV shows.
So it's obviously a very specific sound, and it's not always going to work. Not in every session, at least, but I like having it available from the beginning no matter what, because on the sessions that it does work on, it typically sounds amazing and adds a very specific vibe and texture that other effects cannot achieve. And if you want some secret insight into using delays on vocals and achieving a really optimal sound, click the card you see on screen or the one in the description down below to watch my 10 vocal delay tips video. And that leads me to the last effect that I have here, which is a vocal doubler. Now, I specifically like using this to thicken up the vocal, because essentially what it's doing is creating duplicates of your vocal and then pitching it or detuning it in different ways. And that gives you almost this choir-like illusion. Of course, if you push it very far, you're going to start to hear these voices in a much more noticeable way. But in a subtle way, I find it really helps thicken and enhance a vocal, and I like that. So for this doubler effect, I like to use the doubler 4, although really you just want to try to find some sort of pitch shifting plugin or plugin that can add some more duplicates or harmonies, particularly ones that can detune your voice, but then obviously stack on top of our original vocal. In this case, the doubler 4, particularly this preset, doubler 4 voices, creates 4 duplicates of our original signal or our original vocal and detunes them by 6 and 12 semitones, either in a positive direction or a negative direction. But when stacked together, again, it kind of creates this wall or this harmony sort of section that enhances the vocal that's there. Now, of course, like the others, I am adding just another low cut filter to this, filtering out 131. This is standard at this point, just reducing mud. So I'm going to just actually play the spreader on its own so you can hear exactly what this sounds like.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves.
Right, you can hear it almost has like this chorusy type of effect. Now, if I get rid of my pre and I play it with, let's see how it enhances the vocal with and without.
You know they hating on me when we got for the cheese. They wanna silence us, you know, like Nina Simone, you know, blood on the leaves. Joke to the chief, you see, you gotta believe. They be learning from me on the low, but they know how to teach. They just study all these shows. They hear my songs when they play on the radio and when they watch TV shows.
You can hear how it's adding those detuned layers and creating that chorus effect, which again just gives it this thickness, adds maybe a little bit more width to it at the same time, because these vocals are also panned in different directions, which again is just clearing out the middle and allowing that main dry vocal to dominate. Now, hopefully this video gave you a taste of what the Studio Rack is capable of. I really haven't shown off any of the features that it has, but something that I particularly like is that it gives you access to a wide variety of plugin presets and signal chains from other creators like myself. And of course, this isn't just limited to vocals. You can find plugin chains for drums, basses, leads, masters, really everything under the sun and in between. And something Waves has just rolled out is StudioVerse Instruments, which is now going to expand functionality. So it's not just mixing chains, but also instruments for you to incorporate into your productions. And if you're making beats, I think this is going to be a great value to you as well. And you can probably tell that I'm a pretty big fan of Waves. And really it's just because their plugins are cost effective, they're simple, they work, and a lot of people also use them, which makes collaboration very easy. And if you're curious to see a vocal chain that I put together exclusively using Waves plugins, as well as find out which Waves plugins I like the best, click this video you see on screen right now to watch that. I appreciate y'all for watching. Don't forget to like the video if you haven't already, and subscribe if you're new to see some more mixing tips in the future. I'll catch you next time. Peace.
5